Thank you for joining us in Finding God in Video Games. And in this week's Rewind, we're taking a look back at the Donkey Kong Country series. And there are some games that are enabled for cooperative play, and then there are other titles that just feel built for them. And while Donkey Kong Country certainly be played by yourself, the satisfaction of tag teaming through this adventure is where the real fun lies. Many of the multiplayer titles that we play often split the screen, so they can allow both players to progress independently of each other. Well, I guess to avoid a lot of frustration. Or at other times they utilize an invisible tether that keeps the entire party in proximity to each other while permitting exploration. But not Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong takes the wonderfully bold and kind of old-fashioned approach of demanding intensive coordination between both players as they share the exact same screen space, the same extra lives pool, and oftentimes the exact same vine to swing to safety. And while this can initially lead to a great deal of consternation, the requisite communication and tandem teamwork that's required to pull off some of the more challenging levels can feel like a well-choreographed ballroom dance that leaves each participant both breathless and exhilarated when completed successfully. Good old Donkey Kong and his entire simian family can always be counted on for a challenging experience. And while I credit myself with slightly above average platforming skills, I'll confess I've spent a great deal of banana-based currency purchasing more balloons, which is extra lives for those of you that haven't played, as my wife and I have sent myriads of monkeys to their collective dooms down endless pits, random spikes, or by simply failing to coordinate an end-of-level jump correctly. That one may or may not have resulted in Donkey Kong getting banished to the back of the shelf for a few months. Since our fates are so directly intertwined, our ability to complete a level and move on requires a huge degree of teamwork. There are times that one character must defer to another's abilities, such as when Donkey Kong smashes through an area through raw brute strength, or maybe Dixie Kong uses her hair to float to an invisible ledge. Other times it's as simple as one character having to hold a switch down, so the other can advance and reciprocate. The bottom line is this is a very symbiotic relationship in which neither primate protagonist can succeed without the other's direct support. The concept of a tag team partner has its roots in scripture, but I'm not just referring to what we traditionally consider, the marriage relationship, or even having Christian friends as a support structure. Although those are certainly valid and well-established themes, I'm actually looking at something, or more appropriately someone, who appears very rapidly on the world scene during a very critical moment in the history of the planet, and then just as quickly disappears after having completed his role, without so much as a last name to identify him. Today, we're going to take a look at the enigmatic Simon of Cyrene, the man who carried God's cross. Well, let's start with dispensing with the formalities. We're going to stick to the biblical recording of what occurred here, without acknowledging any unconfirmed traditions that have ascribed certain histories to our man Simon. There can be exceptional value at times to add context through some of the reference works that were written by different historical figures of that day and time, like Josephus or such, but I've observed in my experience that the annals of history don't belong necessarily to the truth, but to the victor far too often, so we should be careful when we quote anything other than the Bible as authoritative. So we're going to relentlessly adhere to only what is recorded in the Bible as we probe this incredibly unique moment in time in human history. First, let's set the scene so we can do this the proper amount of justice. There's a beaten, bloodied, condemned man who has been up all night long, and now he is forced to drag his element of execution with what little remaining strength he possesses. Conservative estimates kind of place the weight of what he had to carry at approximately 125 pounds. It was typical at that time that the vertical portion of the cross would remain affixed at the crucifixion site, and the horizontal beam was the part that was typically carried by the prisoner. Now, if it's the entire cross we're talking about that was carried, this figure balloons up to 300 pounds. Either way, this would be an exhausting task for someone, even if they were in optimal shape, and positively torturous for Jesus in his currently incapacitated state. So as we follow the passage, we'll find that Jesus had finally had enough. He'd reached his breaking point. His human strength had ebbed, and he falls to the ground in exhaustion, stubbornly refusing to allow himself the luxury of calling on his deity to sustain him, even now, when no one would think less of him, or even maybe would have known if he had. But it's here the unexpected happens, as God lays deliberately helpless at the feet of his creation. Through movies, books, songs, and church traditions, there are many different versions of how Simon came to be in the position of carrying the cross of Christ. Some suggest that he volunteered to do so as a kindness. Others attribute his proximity to the situation that maybe he was a follower or disciple of Christ. But we don't know any of those things. So let's get to the facts as Scripture lays out the drama from three distinct but very complementary points of view. And when we place them together, we'll form a full portrait of what really happened on that day. So let's start with the account of Luke. Luke chapter 23 records that it was the Roman soldiers who laid hold of Simon and placed the cross on him. The words lay hold are actually one Greek word in the original text, which is translated to seize and implies a forcefulness. Like, for example, later on when Paul and Silas are seized and arrested, or when Sosthenes is seized and beaten, it's the exact same word there. It's not exactly asking somebody to come along, it's forcing someone to comply. Matthew 27 states that the Romans found Simon and compelled him to carry the cross. Now, the word compelled there is a Greek word very rarely used in the Bible, but was best translated as being pressed into public service. It's the same word that's used in Mark 15, describing this exact same experience when it says that Simon was coming out of the country and was simply passing by when he was conscripted into service. So if we add all these together, we get a very clear picture that Simon of Cyrene was put into the position to carry the cross of Christ based on the decisions of others. And his interest or willingness to do so did not have any bearing on the fact he was going to be forced to complete this task. It's kind of interesting that with all of the myriad of followers that Jesus had, the number of friends and disciples that he was always found with, that someone that Jesus seems to probably never even have met in his mortal life, someone that didn't really appear to have a dog in the fight between Jesus and the Romans, would ultimately be the one that would assist Jesus in drinking the cup that he had been given. This was no James, no John, the fiery brothers who had been ready to call fire down from heaven not too long ago, not Peter, who had been pledged to give his life just hours before all this went down. None of them were chosen to be the vessel of delivery here. In a dramatic scene that was planned from the beginning of time, the role of the one who was destined to literally bear this burden for the king seems to have fallen to someone who had no real interest or intention of becoming famous for this. A co-op partner who was vital, necessary, but from all appearances kind of voluntold to complete this course. Most of us are probably familiar with the passages of Scripture that encourage us to take up our own cross. It's an entirely different thing to realize that we will be called upon unexpectedly to carry someone else's cross, maybe someone we don't even know, maybe at a time when it would be very unpopular to do so. At this point, Jesus was at his lowest moment in many ways. Being seen with him right now, not exactly an ideal photo op if you were trying to keep a low profile. He's pretty unpopular, considering he's about to be murdered and all. Kind of public enemy number one from the Roman point of view. Jews had all turned on him. But this was what history placed in Simon's lap. It was his destiny to help the very Son of God across the finish line. God doesn't typically use angels to help us carry our crosses. He uses people. Simon wasn't perfect. He wasn't even necessarily willing. We don't know. But he was chosen. And if it was good enough for Jesus, it's going to be good enough for me. We will not always get to choose our co-op partners in life. Sometimes we will be the ones doing the heavy lifting. Other times, the Lord will deliver the right person into our lives, even if it's just for a short time, to help us carry our cross to our next stopping point. They may not be who we would have chosen. They may not even be someone that we want helping us. But God, in his infinite wisdom, chooses who will help each of us to make it to our final destination. At various times in our lives, we will all be called upon to inhabit the role of co-op partner for someone. At other times, maybe a Simon will be plucked from the crowd around us to help us shoulder the load. We don't always get to choose whose cross we're going to be carrying. But let's rest assured that if he called us to carry it, it's imperative that we do so. Because one time, The entire fate of humanity rested on the shoulders of a man named Simon to deliver a cross. It rested on a woman named Mary to deliver a child. It rested on a fisherman named Peter to deliver a sermon. And on it goes, as he uses each of us to carry someone's cross just a little farther each day. And when the cross isn't ours to bear, but he asks us to do it anyways, let's remember that the cross we help someone carry might be the one that leads millions to salvation. Just as Simon, the cross he was asked to carry was the one that saved you and me.